Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire, and joining us is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Brandon, always good to be with you.
You
How
too.
You doing?
I'm doing great. New Year's wonderful. Lots of exciting things happening at Word on Fire. I know for you, we're recording this here in mid-January. You're getting ready to go to Rome for your first ad limina visit. What is that? What do you expect?
Yeah. Every 5 years, bishops are obligated in canon law to go ad limina apostolorum. It means to the threshold of the apostles, meaning Peter and Paul, to go to their tombs to pray. And then while we're there, we also visit with the successor of St. Peter, the Pope, and then his curia. So the idea is to kind of give a report on the diocese to the Pope, and also to have a dialogue with him and with his curial, supporters. So it's my first one, so I'll see. I'm going to be giving, when the California bishops go to the dicastery for the new evangelization, they asked me to be the sort of lead figure there. It just means to kind of introduce the discussion and raise some questions. So, and then we see the Pope on our very first day.
I know when we were at the last USCCB meeting, there was other bishops who had just returned from their ad limina visits telling us about it. And they said that Pope Francis and Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul each had unique styles of welcoming the bishops. How does it work? Do you just come in a room and talk or listen, or what's the format?
I don't know. What I've heard about Francis is he comes in and you sit kind of in a horseshoe, around him. And then he says, okay, no formality. What's on your mind? Tell me. And he also, I guess he says, no pecking order, no hierarchy, just anyone that wants to speak, speak. And they've all been very positive about that, like an hour and a half or 2 hours of conversation with them.
All right. Well, today we're going to continue our seemingly never-ending series on the Church Fathers. We keep extending it. It was meant to be one episode.
It's hard to believe we thought we'd do it in one episode.
That was too ambitious for sure. Yeah. So the first episode, which was episode 210 from a few weeks ago, we looked at the Apostolic Fathers. And then last week, we looked at the pre-Nicene and the Nicene Fathers. So those church theologians and leaders from about 100 to about 400. But I figured in this episode, we could tackle the post-Nicene Fathers. So those from roughly 400 to 600, 700 AD. There's some major figures here, as in the previous episodes, that each are probably deserving of their own episode, much less their own course, But let's spend some time with each of them. So we'll begin with St. John Chrysostom. He lived from about 349. So he was born shortly after Nicaea. He was kind of the first generation after Nicaea, died about 407. What should we know about St. John Chrysostom?
Yeah, he's a wonderful figure. And whenever you mention the 4th and into the 5th century, there's this phenomenon that I've always been intrigued by. The best and brightest people in that era all wanted to run to the hills and to live in caves. So you see it time and again. Chrysostom, Jerome is another example of it. Even the young Augustine, who wants to withdraw from society and live as a kind of philosophical, recluse. There was something in the society of the time that was driving the best people away from the cities and from civilization to an intense, we call it now, ascetic and monastic sort of experience. Chrysostom is a good example of that. So he's an Easterner. He's from, the Asia Minor, Turkey, we say today. Eventually, he becomes the Bishop of Constantinople, one of the most important cities in the East. But as a young man, he takes to the hills and he lives in a cave and lives in radical asceticism, which means, fasting and prayer. And think of, St. Benedict, another one from around that same time, who was a young man, runs and lives in a cave. So what was it? Well, there's something societal about it, but also I think there's a theological and spiritual reason. They were seeking intense communion with God. So the young Chrysostom does that, lives that way for a while until it broke his health. And, to no one's great surprise, imagine in those days, especially when there was, so little medical attention available. And if you're fasting dramatically, you're living basically exposed to the elements and so on. So he experienced a kind of a physical collapse, at which point he said, well, I guess I'm not cut out for this kind of really heroic life. So I guess I'll be, a priest. I guess I'll kind of go back and be an ordinary kind of religious servant of the people. we don't think that way. I mean, today we'd probably say, "What's this weirdo doing out in the cave?" But see, in his time, no, that's what the heroes did. That was the highest life. So he kind of settled, and then through a series of interesting twists and turns, he becomes the bishop of this very important see. But imagine now, he's bishop of this imperial city. So the emperor and his court and his family are there. The leading citizens, think of, today it'd be New York or Paris or London, some really big, important city, where the best and brightest of the secular society are there. Well, Chrysostom comes barreling in, as it were, out of his monk's cave with all of that ascetic intensity. And he begins to preach a very, I'd say, radical form of the Christian gospel. Those famous lines about, if you got two shirts in your closet, one belongs to you, one belongs to the man with no shirt. Why do we have these tapestries up on the wall? They don't need to be kept warm, but the poor do. Dramatic, radical things, challenging the, call it secular status quo, to live the Christian thing with seriousness. Well, to no one's great surprise, Chrysostom finds himself exiled. So they don't take kindly to that kind of talk. And, the emperor, I'm sure, wanted a bishop who was accommodating and, would justify his ways and so on. And that was not Chrysostom. So he's known as the golden-throated one, Chrysostom, right? Because of his great preaching. His sermons to this day stir us, even though we read them, through translation, and many centuries later, we're still stirred by his language. Deeply biblical, yes, indeed, but also taking advantage of all the rhetorical genius of his culture. And that's what he's best known for, his biblical commentaries, his theological work, but especially his preaching. And I love that image of the preaching bishop. Mind you, I think I said it maybe, Brandon, our first episode, the church fathers were not academics in our sense. They didn't have tenured teaching positions in universities. So we tend to think theologians are like that. No, these were Origen's a catechist. Chrysostom's a bishop. Augustine's a bishop. Gregory of Nyssa is a bishop. Irenaeus is a bishop. And bishop, by our standards, might mean pastor of a big parish. So the preaching bishop, the bishop who teaches from his cathedra, from his seat, I think of Chrysostom as a prime example of that. Maybe he's the Eastern version of Ambrose in the West. Ambrose, the great preaching and teaching bishop in Milan.
This is probably a good point to talk about one of Chrysostom's titles, which is Doctor of the Church. So the Catholic Church has 36 of these doctors of the Church. Pope Benedict named 2 of them during his pontificate, John of Avila and Hildegard of Bingen. And then Pope Francis named number 36, Gregory of Naric. What is a doctor of the Church? What does it mean to be recognized as this? And then maybe what's special about Chrysostom being a doctor of the Church?
Well, doctor just means teacher, right? So a doctor ecclesiae, a teacher of the church, means someone that preached and taught and wrote in such a way and with such depth that he or she speaks to the whole church about the most fundamental things. So, there are a lot of us who teach in the name of the church, but aren't doing it in a way that is universally compelling. And I would say that the doctors of the church, so recognized, are those that have precisely that quality. Most recently, it's funny you mentioned the doctor of the church, because at our last USCCB meeting, we received from the French episcopacy the summons to make Irenaeus a doctor of the church. And to be honest with you, I kind of thought he already was, but he's not. But of course, Irenaeus, who lived and died in Lyon in France, it's the French bishops now proposing him for that title. So a number of us enthusiastically rose to say, yes, absolutely. So that's what the doctors are. And they're doctors both East and West. So Chrysostom being one of the key Eastern doctors.
Okay, let's turn now to an almost exact contemporary of John Chrysostom, and that's Saint Jerome. So Chrysostom was born in 349. Jerome was born just 2 years earlier, 347. Mm-hmm. They lived into the early 5th century, right around the same period. Who is Jerome? What's he best known for? And talk about him a little bit.
Oh gosh, there's so much to say about Jerome. You're right, that same period. And another one of these people that had a deep affection for caves and for asceticism. Jerome ends his life living in a cave in Bethlehem, right? He's often pictured, the famous painting that Leonardo did and many others, of Jerome hitting himself with a rock. It's an act of asceticism while living in a cave in the desert. So it's that same thing. Just recently, Brandon, when I was in Washington for USCCB meetings, our hotel is on that Massachusetts Avenue where a lot of the embassies are. And I'm going past the embassy of Croatia. And out in front of it is a statue of Jerome. And then you remember, oh yeah, he was born in what's now Croatia. In Roman times, it was a Roman province. So he's from that part of Eastern Europe. Jerome, in some ways, embodies that tension I mentioned last time between the Irenaeus approach and the Origen approach. What I mean here is he's someone who loved classical literary culture. So he read and loved the great authors of both the Greeks and the Romans, loved them, read them with great care, but then becomes enamored of the Bible. And right through his soul runs this tension between reading the classical authors with great affection and also acknowledging the supremacy of the Bible. And at times he's tempted to say just simply no to all the classical literature and just simply yes to the Bible. But I think the tension he felt is one that was bequeathed to the whole tradition. And that it's a happy tension, as I say, not a bad one. He spends time in Rome, and he as a secretary to the Pope, and he is also the kind of leader of a group of mostly women who are interested in kind of deepening their spiritual life, and he becomes sort of a master to them. Again, toward the end of his life, he ends up in Bethlehem. It's there that he does his most important biblical work, and that's what he's most famous for. Deeply indebted to Origen, by the way, in his biblical commentaries, but he does this work of effecting a Latin rendering of the Bible. So the Bible that begins in Hebrew and Greek, it flourishes in Greek forms, of course, in the East. Jerome is the one now who gives great expression in Latin to the totality of the scriptures. He knows Greek by his educational background, and then he learned Hebrew. Again, there he's like Origen, and learns them well enough in dialogue often with the rabbis and so on, that he was able to enter those texts. And he gives us the Bible called the Vulgate, so simply the language of the ordinary people, right? Latin, which becomes the text for the tradition up until very modern times. So everybody from, the medieval doctors, Thomas Aquinas, and up to the Council of Trent, and up and really till modern times, the Bible that we read was the Vulgate of Jerome. So that's where he figures so prominently in the great tradition.
We got that famous quote from Jerome that says, ignorance of scriptures is ignorance of Christ. And he's often held as a patron of biblical studies. Do we still need Jerome today?
Oh, gosh, yeah. And we need him both in terms of his intellectual accomplishments, but also I think his style and his feistiness. Jerome is known as a kind of irascible figure. Didn't suffer fools gladly. And I like that quality. I think there's something good about it. One of my favorite things, it's in a letter, Jerome and Augustine wrote to each other. They're contemporaries. It's hard to imagine these two massively important figures. But at one point, Jerome got so annoyed at Augustine that he referred to him as this Numidian ant. So Augustine's from North Africa, Numidia, right? And he called him a Numidian ant. Augustine, But I kind of like the irascibility of Jerome.
All right, well, let's turn to the Numidian ant next, Augustine. I think you'd probably agree with me, the most important and influential church father. He's kind of the pinnacle of this whole series. You, of course, have written and spoken a lot on St. Augustine. We've got our Pivotal Players episode on Augustine. We also have, by the way, if you're looking for a good translation of Augustine's most famous book, his Confessions, check out our Word on Fire Classics edition. It's a beautiful translation by Frank Sheed. Bishop Barron's got an introduction to it. I think most people, Bishop, know the name Augustine. Maybe they know about the Confessions, but what are some things beyond that we should know about this great figure?
You spend your life reading Augustine, and I don't say that in a flippant way. I think of my mentor, Robert Sokolowski, that said certain great books you should read every year of your life, and put the trivial stuff aside and read the really great books over and over again. Well, Augustine is in that category. I've told students for years, have the Confessions of Augustine simply by your nightstand. Just have it there all the time. Go back to it again and again. Augustine is born in the middle of the 4th century, about 354, dies the beginning of the 5th century in 430. He dies right as the Roman Empire is coming apart, and that helps to explain, especially his great work called The City of God. Augustine's a young man. He's North African, so he's a Roman culturally. Augustine never knew foreign languages very well. He knew a little bit of Greek, wasn't very good at it, didn't know any Hebrew at all. But boy, he was a master of the Latin language because he's trained in rhetoric. And rhetoric in the ancient times had a very philosophical overtone. We probably speak of linguistics, philology, philosophy of language, education. All that would kind of be under the heading of rhetoric. That's what he studied as a young man. He becomes, in some ways, the last of the great classical Latin authors. So, Suetonius and Cicero and everybody else, Virgil, then come right up to Augustine, maybe the last of the great masters. If you like language, you like how language works, that's one of the great reasons to study Latin. You can read Augustine in his own language. So he's a young student of rhetoric. He wants nothing more than to be a famous speaker and a politico in a way, someone that would be involved in the high affairs of state, writing speeches for the emperor, et cetera, et cetera. So he goes through a number of schools in studying rhetoric. He then becomes, and it's one of the most important moments in his life, he becomes a follower of Mani, who was a Persian mystic. He gave rise to a system called Manichaeism. And we could spend a whole semester course talking about that. But Augustine, for 9 years, is an adept of this kind of strange, mystical, religious system. Eventually, under the influence of the great Ambrose of Milan, he begins the process had been exposed to Christianity as a young man by his mother, but the process of becoming a catechumen and being baptized. Once that happened, he wanted to really bring the two parts of his life together. He wanted to bring to bear his great studies of rhetoric and language and philosophy in service of Christianity. And so he wants to be, as I mentioned, I think last time, a philosophical recluse. He wanted to head off to the country with a few friends and live a sort of isolated life of speculation and writing and so on. He makes his way home to North Africa, but then is called upon to be a priest and then eventually bishop of this little town of Hippo in North Africa. And so that's how we know him as Augustine of Hippo, the bishop of that place. And it's there that he does his truly great writing. The most important text, the Confessions that you alluded to, his intellectual autobiography, in some ways it's the first autobiography ever written. He invents the genre. You also have to read the De Trinitate, his great work on the Trinity. There's no better work on this great central Christian mystery. And then the one I alluded to a few minutes ago, the De Civitate Dei, on the City of God, which is the first philosophy of history written in the West. Without that book, there's no Hegel, for example. But it's also a book that is filled with Bible and filled with the history of salvation and filled with Christian theology. Augustine sets the tone for all of medieval thought. He's the last of the classical thinkers, and in some ways the first of the medieval thinkers. All of them, and I mean everybody, and from Anselm to Bernard to Thomas Aquinas to Bonaventure, they're all indebted to Augustine. So that's sort of an outline of life and work. He's one of the 3 or 4 indispensable figures to understand Christianity. If you push me against the wall and ask people, who are they? I mean, you'd say Paul. So, after Jesus himself, Paul, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. Now, we might have to go and be careful picking the next one, but Augustine's one of those, monumental figures.
We talked about some of his major books. What would you identify as some of his key enduring ideas that have shaped the theology of Christianity?
Well, he's called the Doctor of Grace for good reason, the Doctor of Gratiae, right? So one of his most important battles was against the Pelagian heresy toward the end of his life. Pelagius, who maintained that salvation is an issue really of the human will. It's a matter of summoning the willpower to do what God's called us to do, that we can, as it were, save ourselves through heroic effort. That's a very enduring heresy, by the way. Comes up time and again. In our own time, in all these kind of myths of progress and of self-actualization, all that language is very Pelagian. Augustine realized if Pelagius is right, Christianity cannot endure because it's a salvation religion. We don't need just a life coach. We need a savior. Jesus didn't come just to teach us things that we can then do on our own. He came to save us. And so the necessity of grace, I think, is absolutely basic to Augustine. And you can then see that running through the whole of his work. I don't say, Brandon, that he's a great theologian of the divine providence. Read the Confessions now under that rubric. Someone who's reading his life as the unfolding of a plan that was not clear to him at every moment, but was clear to God. God was luring him and drawing him in a direction. So I think the idea of the divine providence, that fits in very much to the city of God, which is God's providence now writ large. So the Confessions is the providence of God in Augustine's own life. The city of God is the story of how God is working through all of time and space and history. So I mentioned those as a few of the key issues for Augustine.
Well, may St. Augustine in heaven forgive us for shortchanging him and devoting 7 minutes here to his entire corpus. But let's move on. I want to cover one final church father. He's kind of near the end of what's typically considered the range of church fathers, around the 6th, 7th century. And that's St. Gregory the Great. What should we know about him?
Well, Gregory the Great, he was great. Gregory,
he was great.
A Benedictine monk from Rome, and a man that wanted to devote his life to prayer and to study and the quiet life, and then through a series of interesting circumstances is drawn into the more political side of the church, eventually becoming the Bishop of Rome and becoming the Pope. Gregory writes one of the most important works on Saint Benedict. So his life of Benedict is how we know about the saint that founded his order, and it set the tone for much of the monastic life in the West. Gregory also writes this wonderful book, and since I became a bishop some years ago, I went back to it. I've been going back to it more and more, called the Pastoralis, or the Rule of the Pastoral Life. It's Gregory reflecting on what it means to be a governor, if you want, in the life of the church, what it means to be in a position of pastoral leadership. And it's a book of great theological depth, but also of real practical insight. He's someone that was actually involved in governing the life of the church. So that's a text that I go back to a lot in my own work as a not just teacher, but a governor, a ruler in the church.
Bishop, let's close this entire series with one question. We kind of teased it out at the very beginning in the first episode, but I want to ask it one more time. Why should listeners read the Church Fathers? Why do they still have enduring value?
Well, maybe I'll cite again my old teacher, Agnes Cunningham, remember, who said, she's a patristic expert, said to me when I was a very young guy at the seminary, and she knew I liked Thomas Aquinas, and she said, we're just delighted, Bob, that you like Thomas Aquinas, but you will never be a theologian until you know the Church Fathers. And her intuition was dead right, because the Fathers set the tone for Christianity. Again, Paul is the first great theologian, but then the Fathers after Paul are the ones who give shape and form and substance to the Christian thing. So all the issues that we talk about, the questions that we entertain, were issues that they talked about and the questions that they entertained. In some ways, if I can riff on Whitehead, all of theology is a footnote to the Fathers. I mean, we're still playing the game that they inaugurated. So until you know them, you're not going to enter this game well. You won't play it with panache until you know the way the Fathers played it.
Well, that sound means it's time for our regular listener question. Every episode, we pick at least one question to ask Bishop Barron. If you have one, send it in. Visit askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question on any device. Today, we have a question from all the way on the other side of the world. George in Sydney, Australia, is asking an interesting question about whether we should pray for people who are sick. Here's his question.
Hi Bishop Barron, my name is George. I'm a medical doctor from Sydney, Australia. My question is regarding praying for the sick and how we can ask for the intercession of Mary and the saints and God's help in helping the sick if we believe that our destiny is predetermined and that sickness should be seen as redemptive. Thank you and God bless.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I guess it's a both and. I wouldn't see that as an either or. I think, we appropriately pray that sick people become well. Let's ask God. The Bible certainly gives us a strong warrant for that. Jesus was very interested in healing bodies. Now, again, Jesus didn't heal everybody. So we hear stories of Jesus curing the blind and the deaf and the crippled and so on. Didn't heal every single one of them. So, pray, ask, intercede. But then if it becomes clear that that's not the will of God, then indeed you're right. The right thing to do is to place that suffering within the context of God's providence so that the suffering itself becomes a ladder or a vehicle. And perhaps it's what God wants you to wrestle with precisely to come closer to Him. And the great spiritual teachers have seen 1,000 ways that works, right? So I guess I would say do both. When someone that you love is sick, pray that they might be healed. Pray that God would intervene. But if God has determined, no, that's not what He wants to do, then dedicate that sickness to Him. Remember that lovely prayer of Newman's, that if I'm puzzled, may my puzzlement serve you. If I'm lost, may my being lost serve you. So if I'm sick and it's clear, I've been asking the Lord, but it's clear that He's not going to cure me. Okay, may my sickness give glory to Him. May my sickness be a way to reach Him. So I think you do both.
Well, thanks, George, for that great question. Thanks to everybody who's listened not only to this episode, but our long series on the Church Fathers. We've gone ahead and linked to all of the books that we've been mentioning over the last few episodes. So the best thing to do after learning about the Church Fathers is to read them. Don't be intimidated by them. Almost all of them, we have accessible English translations that are extremely lucid and engaging. So we've linked to a lot of them. And the show notes for this episode, you can also find the links at wordonfireshow.com. Well, thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire Show.